From the heart of Africa, Burkina Faso shines anew.
The Africa Spoke. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful African stories.
You know what's truly outrageous? In a world obsessed with billion-dollar tech, hyperloops, and vertical farms scraping the skies, the most revolutionary agricultural idea didn't come from Silicon Valley. It came from 12 million abandoned car tires rotting in the dust of West Africa. Let that sink in. While think tanks in Washington debate smart farming and billionaires launch satellites to monitor soil moisture, one young African leader looked at a pile of trash and thought, what if we grow onions in tires? Sounds like satire, right? A headline straight out of The Onion, pun fully intended. And yet, this so-called laughable idea is exactly what turned Burkina Faso, once one of the poorest nations on earth, into a food exporter almost overnight. So the question isn't how did they do it, it's why the hell weren't we doing it first? Just a few years ago, Burkina Faso was battling food shortages, environmental decay, and youth unemployment so high, some called it a ticking bomb. And then came Ibrahim Traoré, 34 years old, military-trained, anti-establishment, and wildly imaginative. When most leaders begged the IMF for aid, Traoré called a cabinet meeting and said, "Stop throwing away tires. Plant onions in them." No joke. That was the strategy. His ministers thought he'd lost it. Experts scoffed. Villagers rolled their eyes. Meanwhile, in the West, we probably would have called that recycling awareness. In America, we build billion-dollar food labs to make lab-grown steak. In Burkina Faso, they recycled Goodyears into onion beds, and somehow ended up with more food and less debt. What do you think? Genius innovation or desperate absurdity? Drop your opinion in the comments. And hey, if that shocked you like it shocked me, hit like or share. We're just getting started. Because what began as a bizarre gamble quickly spiraled into the most unexpected agricultural revolution the Sahel had ever seen. At first, even within his own government, the idea was mocked. Trong Hun Trong Lup Se? That sounded more like a street joke than state policy. Some of his ministers reportedly chuckled during the meeting. A few suggested it might be a decent pilot for a school garden. No one, absolutely no one, thought this could become national strategy. But Traoré wasn't operating on emotion. He was operating on brutal data. Burkina Faso was importing over 70,000 tons of onions every year, mostly from Niger, Côte d'Ivoire, even as far as Europe. Meanwhile, over 12 million tires lay abandoned across the country, rotting, leaching chemicals into the soil, breeding mosquitoes, and being burned, poisoning the air. No food, no jobs, but plenty of trash. So here's the twist. Instead of seeing garbage, Traoré saw self-contained water-retaining micro-farms. Tires site filled with compost, shaped into neat growing beds that, when tested, held moisture 60% longer than open field plots. They were wind-resistant, pest-resistant, and dirt-cheap. This wasn't some utopian theory. Traoré had data from Cuba, India, even the Philippines, where micro-farming in tires had been quietly tested on a small scale. The science was there. What lacked was political will and the guts to bet an entire nation on something so wildly unconventional. Now, let's pause here for a second. In the US, we have surplus land, irrigation subsidies, GPS-guided tractors. We still lose over 30% of our food due to inefficiency. Meanwhile, Burkina Faso turned literal garbage into an agricultural engine. Can you blame them for seeing us as wasteful? What happened next surprised everyone. A pilot project launched in Bobo Dioulasso, the second-largest city. Volunteers cut, stacked, and filled tires with nutrient-rich soil made from food waste and local compost. Onion seeds were planted, and within just a few weeks, the results were astonishing. Onions didn't just grow, they thrived. Greener, fatter, healthier, Yields jumped by 40%, water usage dropped in half. Pests, minimal. The controlled environment of the tire rings proved harder for insects to penetrate. And for once, the desert didn't win. Call it coincidence, or maybe call it competence, but something else was growing too. Curiosity. Villagers who once mocked the idea started collecting tires. Kids joined in, parents followed, and soon, the smell of fresh onion greens filled neighborhoods where trash once piled high. If you're still thinking, but this can't be scaled, right? Well, just wait. Because this is where things went from clever to historic. Tell me, if your city had 12 million pieces of waste lying around, and someone turned them into food, jobs, and export cash, would you mock it or would you follow it? If that makes you rethink your idea of innovation, leave a comment. And if you're as curious as I was, hit share. This story is only heating up. People didn't just collect tires anymore, they started trading them. By the end of that first harvest, local markets saw baskets of onions where only dust existed months before. Mothers who used to sell fried snacks under umbrellas were now selling produce from tire gardens in front of their homes. Children helped water the plots before school. And this wasn't isolated. The pilot's success turned into state policy. The government issued a buyback program. For every tire delivered to a designated cooperative, the collector received a small subsidy. It wasn't much, just enough to make it worth the effort. But when you have millions of tires and tens of thousands of unemployed youth, it suddenly becomes a machine of mass mobilization. The country went from importing onions to producing enough to export. In less than a year, over 12 million tires were repurposed into micro-farms across Burkina Faso. That number is real, not metaphorical, not exaggerated. It's tracked through a national database using barcodes for every tire lot. Tire beds were given IDs, assigned to cooperatives, and monitored like any industrial asset. That level of structure might sound surprising coming from a country many only associate with poverty. But that's the point. We're often wrong about who's organized and who's not. And here's where the American perspective gets uncomfortable. While we debate the ethics of GMOs or whether food delivery drones are sustainable, Burkina Faso used rubber waste, the kind our tire companies dump in Africa, and turned it into an economic engine. It's not just clever, it's poetic. And more importantly, it challenges the global hierarchy of ideas. For too long, the West has assumed innovation flows one way, from rich to poor, from tech hubs to rural huts. But what if we've been looking in the wrong direction? If this idea had come from a lab in San Francisco, CNN would have called it revolutionary. If it had been pitched at Davos, it would be trending on LinkedIn. But because it came from the streets of Ouagadougou, it was dismissed, until the results became undeniable. So here's a question. Do we really value innovation, or do we just value it when it comes in a polished pitch deck and a blazer? Let me know your take in the comments. And if this flipped your assumptions even slightly, give it a share. You never know who else needs to hear this. The economic ripple was immediate. Prices in local markets plummeted. What once cost 800 CFA francs per kilo, about $30, dropped to 300 francs. That's not just affordable, that's survival. For families surviving on less than $2 a day, the difference between 800 and 300 isn't a discount, it's dinner. It's whether or not a child eats that night. And that price drop didn't come from subsidies. It came from surplus, from overproduction, from turning something once considered useless into a scalable national resource. By mid-2025, Burkina Faso wasn't just feeding itself. It had become a regional supplier. Convoys of trucks carried tons of onions to Ghana, Côte d'Ivoire, and even Senegal. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso had a food surplus. That statement alone should give you pause. And this wasn't just good for farmers, it was geopolitical leverage. Traoré understood something many Western-trained economists forget. Food isn't just food, it's negotiation power. If your country depends on you for onions, a staple in every African dish, then they listen to you differently at the next trade summit. This wasn't charity, it was soft power, and it came from garbage. Now think about how different that is from our playbook. In the US, we spend billions on food aid programs. We ship tons of surplus wheat and corn to developing nations, much of which ends up rotting in ports or undermining local farmers. Burkina Faso flipped that model. It became the one shipping, the one feeding, not because it received more, but because it needed less. This wasn't a food program. It was a sovereignty strategy disguised as agriculture. Even the country's narrative changed. For decades, Burkina Faso was seen as an aid-dependent, conflict-ridden, landlocked burden. But now, foreign journalists were flying in to cover onions. Paris Match called it the Onion Revolution. The BBC ran a piece titled From Rubber Waste to Regional Powerhouse. And Bloomberg, reluctantly perhaps, admitted, Burkina Faso has pulled off one of the most unexpected agricultural turnarounds in modern African history. If this happened in New Mexico, there would be documentaries. If it were Israel, there'd be tech conferences about it. But because it's West Africa, the global reaction was muted curiosity, cautious praise, as if success needs to be verified by GPS coordinates. So I ask again, why does innovation only get applause when it's dressed in Western aesthetics? If this made you think not just about food, but about who gets to be called innovative, leave your thoughts below. And yes, if you haven't already, share this with someone who thinks real change can only come from the top. What truly set this revolution apart wasn't just the economics, it was the optics. Because suddenly, tires weren't just trash. They were everywhere, stacked neatly in front yards, lining roadsides, forming perfect circular beds of onion greens. Entire neighborhoods began to smell different, not of dust and diesel, but of freshly cut produce. In schools, children started drawing tire gardens in their notebooks. In villages, old rubber rings once used to burn trash were now treated like gold. And in rallies, President Traoré began holding up a tire like it was a national flag. He didn't say, "This is a farming tool." He said, "This is our weapon of independence." And the people believed him. Because it wasn't about onions. It was about dignity returning to the hands that plant them. For the first time in years, men who had abandoned their farms returned. Women who once sold soap and candies at bus stops started their own backyard gardens. Teenagers who dreamed of fleeing to Europe joined youth cooperatives to cut, clean, and stack tires for cash. Burkina Faso didn't just grow food, it grew participation. It reactivated a workforce that had lost faith in their own soil. Here's a detail that blew my mind. The military, instead of patrolling borders, was mobilized to transport tires from dumps to villages, not guns. Tires. And that move wasn't symbolic, it was strategic. By involving the military in a civilian initiative, Traoré muted criticism about his authoritarian leanings. He gave the army purpose beyond defense. He integrated them into development. It was clever. It was calculated. And it worked. Now let's flip the lens for a moment. In America, we often associate developing countries with aid, handouts, instability. But what happens when that country, with no coastline, under sanctions, limited resources, finds a way to feed itself and become an exporter? Do we celebrate it or do we question it? Because make no mistake, some Western analysts weren't thrilled. They called it agricultural populism. They warned of environmental risks, market manipulation, potential over-reliance on a single crop. But ask yourself this, would they have said the same if this were a pilot program in Denmark? If you're seeing the double standard as clearly as I am, hit that like button. Better yet, drop a comment. What would your country do with 12 million tires? And if you're still wondering how far this could go, stick around. Because the next chapter isn't about onions at all. Success, of course, attracts attention. And attention in geopolitics always comes with a price. By late 2026, what began as a humble domestic initiative had become a continental case study. Delegations from Mali, Niger, Chad, and Senegal visited Burkina Faso to walk through rows of rubber-grown onions, take soil samples, and scribble notes furiously. Some quietly admitted, "Why didn't we think of this first?" Others didn't say anything, but began buying used tires by the truckload. Even countries outside Africa took notice. India and China sent agricultural envoys. They weren't just curious, They were calculating. Because what Burkina Faso had done was break the aid model, the very system many countries had grown used to depending on. The West exports fertilizer, irrigation tech, GMO seeds. Burkina Faso exports a blueprint that requires none of that. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable, especially for those of us watching from the United States. We spend hundreds of millions every year funding food security programs in Africa. And yet, none of our models, not USAID, not the World Bank, not Gates Foundation pilots, produce the kind of scalability Traoré's tire farms achieved in under 2 years. And worse, we didn't even see it coming. Because we weren't looking. In Washington, food security discussions often center around drones, climate resilience, data dashboards. But this was low-tech, grassroots, dusty. It didn't fit the script. So when journalists started asking, why aren't we supporting this? The silence from our institutions was telling. Some critics labeled it unregulated, unscientific, unsustainable. But let's interrogate that. Unscientific? It was tested, tracked, and documented better than most NGO pilots. Unsustainable? The system used 60% less water, 0 synthetic fertilizer, and no fossil fuel-based transport. Unregulated? Every tire bed was barcoded and GPS tracked. So, what was the real issue? Here's a hypothesis. Maybe the problem wasn't with the method. Maybe it was with the messenger. Would global institutions embrace this model if it had been presented by Harvard or Stanford researchers instead of a 34-year-old African military leader? That's the uncomfortable question. And maybe it's time we start admitting that innovation without prestige is often ignored. Tell me if I'm wrong. Or if you've seen this play out before, when a developing nation solves its own problem, but no one listens until the West approves. Drop your thoughts, comment, share. Because the most radical ideas often come wrapped in the dust of old tires, not PowerPoint decks. Once the numbers were undeniable, the machine moved faster than anyone expected. Crop diversification began. Once onions proved the soil bed system worked, farmers started experimenting. Tomatoes, peppers, leafy greens, even medicinal herbs. And to their shock, most of it flourished. That's not an exaggeration. Agricultural records from 2027 showed that tire-based farms yielded 30–40% higher productivity than conventional dryland plots across multiple crops. And it wasn't just about food. The ecosystem began expanding sideways. Local engineers, not foreign contractors, developed solar-powered drip irrigation units, tailored specifically for tire gardens. Cooperatives began pooling resources to buy panels, pumps, and water tanks. Village schools started teaching tire farming as a practical science module. Microfinance banks rolled out special loan packages for tire-based agriculture, most of them targeting rural women. For the first time in many regions, women didn't just work the land, they owned the system. That alone deserves more attention. Burkina Faso didn't stumble upon success. It built a parallel economy, fueled by waste, knowledge sharing, and decentralized ownership. And here's what that did. It weakened the grip of dependency. The same villages that once stood in long queues waiting for grain aid were now setting prices in local markets. They weren't receiving handouts. They were giving out harvests. But with success came pushback. As tire-based farming spread across the Sahel, international chemical fertilizer firms began raising alarms. Some argued that tire residue could leach into crops over time. Others warned of fire hazards or black market hoarding. Let's unpack that. The fire risk? It existed before. The tires were already burning in dumps. The hoarding? That's what happens when a resource gains value. And the chemical leaching? To date, no major health hazard has been recorded. In fact, studies conducted jointly with Senegalese agronomists in 2028 showed no significant contamination in onions grown in properly layered, compost-filled tires. So what's really going on? This is the uncomfortable twist. When poor people innovate using materials they weren't supposed to own, suddenly, regulation shows up faster than recognition. Now let's switch lenses again. In America, upcycling is a trend. Turning skateboards into bookshelves, That's cool. Recycling tires into garden beds? That's a Pinterest post. But if a rural African country does it at scale, suddenly it's environmentally questionable. You feel the double standard? If you've ever seen innovation get punished instead of praised, let's talk about it in the comments. And if this whole thing is starting to sound like more than just farming, you're right. Because up next, we're going to see how Burkina Faso turned onions into global influence. By 2029, Burkina Faso wasn't just feeding itself, it was negotiating trade deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The country signed export contracts with India and China, shipping onions grown in rubber tires to markets thousands of miles away. Food economists were stunned. One of the most landlocked, drought-prone nations in the Sahel had become a net food exporter, and not just of onions. Tomatoes, peppers, even dried herbs were being processed and sold. The income didn't disappear into offshore accounts or padded ministries. It was reinvested. Villages that had never seen paved roads now had clinics, solar-powered water stations, and subsidized schools. Traoré's administration funneled revenue directly into rural infrastructure. That wasn't a PR move, it was a strategy. The more productive the countryside became, the harder it was to destabilize politically. This wasn't some magic turnaround. There were real challenges. Soil fatigue began showing up in regions that reused the same tires too frequently. Some farmers started using synthetic fertilizer to speed things up, triggering concerns about long-term sustainability. And of course, the global onion market wasn't always friendly. In 2030, a sudden price drop nearly halved export revenue. But again, they didn't panic. The government created a national onion reserve, a stockpile strategy borrowed from how the U.S. handles grain surpluses. They also invested in solar-powered dehydrators to preserve surplus produce for off-season exports. Farmers were trained in crop rotation, and local researchers developed compost-based soil treatments to combat fatigue. The system matured. It didn't stay experimental. It became institutional. By now, the symbolism of the tire was deeply embedded in the country's identity. Murals were painted in schools, tires filled with green shoots, surrounded by sunbursts and national flags. Artists wrote songs about it. Proverbs emerged in local dialects. One of the most repeated, "If onions can grow in rubber, hope can grow anywhere." That line says more than any report ever could. And here's something else. This wasn't just Burkina Faso's victory. Other nations took notice, not as a novelty, but as a blueprint. Mali launched a tire farming initiative in its northern desert regions. Ethiopia tested rubber-based hydroponics for coffee seedlings. Even oil-rich Nigeria, drowning in its own waste, rolled out pilot projects in 2 states. The African Union invited Traoré to speak at the 2031 Food Security Summit. His speech wasn't technical, it was political. He said, "Africa does not need charity, Africa needs imagination. Look at a tire and you see waste. We saw bread." The applause wasn't polite, it was thunderous, but not everyone was cheering. Critics, both domestic and abroad, called him a populist in a uniform. They warned that over-centralized control of food systems could backfire, that tire farming was a gimmick, not a legacy. And yet, the results were on the ground. Not in PDFs, not in strategy decks. In baskets of produce sold in markets that used to sit empty. In villages that used to burn tires now growing food in them. In kids who once chased plastic bottles for fun, now helping their mothers plant rows of onions. In the US, we often say, "Think outside the box." Traoré didn't think outside the box. He looked at the box itself, black, round, dusty, and asked, why not fill it with life? So maybe this isn't just a story about food, or even politics. Maybe it's about the courage to redefine the possible, not in theory, but in dirt, in rubber, in sweat. If that made you feel something, or even a little, share it. Because someone out there is sitting on their own pile of waste still waiting for permission to start. And if you agree that innovation doesn't need polish, just guts, then leave a comment. Let's talk about what real change looks like when no one believes it's possible.